All right, today we're going to be taking a peek at something called a tree diagram. And a tree diagram is a great tool to use for complex probability outcomes. Remember, probability is the likelihood of something happening. So, flipping a coin, there is a probability or a likelihood that it might come up heads or tails. So, we would say either heads and tails both have a 1 out of 2 probability of coming up. We have 2 possible outcomes, heads or tails. One side is each. But this tree diagram will help us solve problems like this probability question. If we flipped 2 coins, what would the probability come that of if we had both of them come up as heads? What's our probability that both will come up as heads? So let's use this tree diagram to start figuring that out. All right. Well, first of all, we have to kind of think of each coin as its own thing. So we have coin 1 and we have coin 2. Okay, so let's think about just that first coin. We flip it in the air, it hits the counter or the floor, wherever you're flipping it on, and we have 2 possible outcomes of that first coin. Okay, that first coin could come up heads, which is what we want, or it could come up tails, which is what we don't want, because we're trying to figure out the probability that we're going to get 2 heads. Okay, so that means we have a 1 out of 2 chance of it coming up as tails, and we have a 1 out of 2 chance of it coming up as heads. All right, so far, so good. All right, but now let's think about that second coin. All right, we're going to think about that second coin and think about the possible outcomes. Well, one possible outcome, and they kind of go together, is that the first coin gets heads. And then we have 2 possible outcomes. If the first coin comes up heads, we have 2 more possible outcomes, right? The first coin could come up as heads, and then the second one could come up as heads. Yay, that's a good thing in terms of our probability. We also could have the first coin come up as heads, and the second coin come up as tails. That is a possible outcome. First coin heads, first coin tails. Okay, now if we go back to the beginning, that first coin could also come up tails. If that first coin comes up tails, well, we have 2 possible outcomes again of the second coin, right? So we get tails on our first coin. Our second coin could come up heads, or it could come up tails. So if we read this tree diagram, we can see that we have 4 possible outcomes for flipping these coins. We could get the first outcome as heads, heads. We could get the second outcome as heads, tails. A third different outcome of tails and then heads. And then a fourth outcome of tails and then another tails. All right. So we have 4 possible outcomes. All right. Now, if we are trying to figure out, well, what is the outcome that we get heads, heads? Well, only one of these paths lead us to heads, heads. We would have to get heads with the first one, heads with the second one. All right. So we have 1 possible outcome out of 1, 2, 3, 4 outcomes. So our probability is 1 out of 4 that we're going to get heads, heads. All right. Our probability that we are going to get heads and then tails is also 1/4. We could get heads with the first coin, tails with the second. We have a 1 out of 4 probability that we're going to get tails with the first one and heads with the second one, and a 1 out of 4 possibility that we get tails, tails. All right. So let's say someone asked us, okay, you get to pick. For $1 million, you can pick either you think both coins are going to come up heads, heads. You think both coins are going to come up tails, tails. Or you think that's going to be a combination of 1 coin coming up heads, 1 coin coming up tails. Well, according to probability, what is the smart thing to do? Well, let's look at our tree diagram. I have a 1 out of 4 chance that it's going to come up heads, heads. There's only one possible outcome because both coins, heads, heads, have to come up with heads. Tails, tails, I have a 1 out of 4 probability as well because I would get tails and then I would get another tails. Okay. Well, what's the probability that we would get a heads and a tails? All right. If we flipped them both at the same time, what are the probability we'd get a heads as a tail and a tails, one of each? Well, we could get heads with the first coin, tails with the second coin, or we could get tails with the first coin and heads with the second coin. So we actually have two different paths that would get us heads and a tails. So our probability is 2 out of 4. Or we can reduce that down to 1/2, 1 out of 2 as well. So this is your best probability. Your best probability when you flip two coins at the same time is that you're going to get one of each because we have two possible paths that would get us one heads and one tails, where we only have one path that would get us two heads and one path that would get us two tails. So that's how a tree diagram works with probability. You're going to be working with a few today. All right.